Hello and welcome to members and guests to this, our 7th quarantine special. This month we've got Dr. John Greenacre, who's a lecturer in history at the University of Suffolk, talking to us about the case of Private Benjamin Hart of 4th Battalion Suffolk Regiment, who was executed by firing squad during the First World War.
On a high slope above the northern bank of the Somme, there's a small Commonwealth war grave cemetery, Suzanne Military Cemetery No. 3. Amongst the men buried there, there's one who we know exactly how he died. We can be very specific about the manner of his death because Private Benjamin Hart of the Suffolk Regiment was shot at dawn for the crime of desertion. Many popular histories of the First World War approach the subject from an emotional point of view, and from this we get many of the myths and legends that still persist, lions led by donkeys, the endless slaughter, and others that also surround the subject of military justice and execution during the war. So it's worth to start with to put this into context and to look at some statistics. During the course of the First World War, around 300,000 soldiers were tried by court-martial. That's about 1 in 20 of those that served. Of those 300,000, about 10% of them, around 30,000, were tried for capital offences, those that attracted the death penalty. Of those 30,000, 10% of those were convicted of those offences, around 3,000. But of that 3,000 convicted of a capital offence, only 346 were executed. Of that 346, 40 of them were executed for crimes that would have attracted a capital sentence back in civilian streets, such as murder. That leaves 306 then that were executed at some point during the First World War for a military offence. The most prevalent of those was desertion. 266 of them were tried for desertion, and the most prevalent nation, you won't be surprised to hear, is the British, with 291 of those 306 executed for the military offences. So we have to look at the fact that this is a very small issue in terms of the number of soldiers who would have encountered any form of the death penalty, either from knowing someone, being in the same battalion at the same time, taking part in a firing squad. But that doesn't make it any better at an individual level. So it's worth looking at it from an individual point of view to see what we can glean from the methods and the process leading up to execution for a capital offence. And I've chosen to look at Benjamin Hart. The first reason to look at Benjamin Hart is because he's the only soldier from the Suffolk Regiment executed during the course of the First World War. That's what began my interest in him. And I first found him in the 1911 census. And became more interested when I found that at the time he was residing with his family at No. 2 Devonshire Road, which is only a stone's throw along the back hamlet from the university that I teach at on the waterfront. At the time of the 1911 census, Benjamin Albert Hart was a 15-year-old living with his widowed father, who worked in the metal foundry of Ransom Sins and Jeffries down on the waterfront in Ipswich. His older brother Ernest had left home and was married, but also worked in the same metal foundry. Both Ernest and Benjamin joined the local territorial battalion, the 4th Battalion, the Suffolk Regiment, before the war broke out. The 4th Battalion deployed towards the end of 1914, and by 1916, the end of 1916, it found itself on the Somme, moving from Bray, just north of the river, forward to Maurepas, taking up positions at Beauchevin, formerly part of the French line. On the 14th of December, number 14 platoon of A Company were warned for a spell in the trenches. When they formed up in the morning under their platoon commander, Captain Middleditch, Benjamin Hart was there and heard the orders given. When the platoon reformed in the afternoon, ready to move forward to the trenches, Hart was absent. Benjamin Hart did not reappear at any point during the tour of duty in the trenches, which lasted 48 hours. Around about the same time as the platoon were coming out of the trenches on the 16th of December, Hart handed himself in to the town major in Bray. He was subsequently arrested for the crime of desertion, and 3 days later he was charged with desertion by his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Copeman. Once charged, Copeman couldn't then deal with it any further, it being a capital offence. It had to be referred to court-martial. Now, you may sometimes hear a court-martial referred to as a kangaroo court, but nothing could be further from the truth. They were very tightly regulated, and all the instructions were laid down in the Manual of Military Law 1914. There were different types of court-martial, and depending on the type that was appropriate, different numbers of members of the board, essentially the jury, and the type of punishment that it could deal out to those that had been charged. Because Benjamin Hart had been charged with a capital offence and he was deployed on operations in France, it had to be a field general court-martial. And therefore it would have 4 members of the board who would sit in judgment over Hart. The court-martial convened on the 28th of December. So who are these men that are going to stand in judgment over Benjamin Hart for his offence? They're all officers. Typical, you might say, men who wouldn't understand, but of these 4 officers who come from a different brigade altogether than Hart and therefore wouldn't know him by reputation or rumour. Of those 4 officers ranked between major and lieutenant, 2 of them would be subsequently killed in action. One of them, Henderson, would win the Victoria Cross at the Second Battle of Scarpe before being killed the following day. So these men, these officers, are men that have shared the same rigours and the same dangers as Hart himself, and understand what life and fighting in the trenches is all about. The court opened with the prosecution. The first witness for the prosecution was Captain Middleditch, Hart's platoon commander. He gave a short statement to the effect that when he had issued orders that the platoon were to make ready to go to the trenches, that Hart was there, but when they deployed later that afternoon, he was absent and he did not reappear for the entire spell that they were in the front line. This was followed by a second witness for the prosecution, Captain King from A Company, who confirmed Middleditch's story without elaborating. The third witness, however, is interesting. The third witness was Major Frank Pretty. At the time, Frank Pretty was the town major of Bray, therefore in charge of billeting and movement around what was quite an important town just on the north bank of the Somme. Frank Pretty was a well-known officer from the 4th Battalion, the Suffolk Regiment, who had been detached for this duty. And so therefore Hart would have known him when he walked into his office on the 16th of December. But Pretty almost immediately had him arrested, and he confirms this in his witness statement. After each member of the prosecution had spoken, Hart was given the chance to cross-examine those prosecution witnesses, but declined to do so in each of the 3 cases. Next, it was the turn of the defence. There was only one witness for the defence, and that was Hart himself. Hart complained that his nerves were bad, that he was not mentally equipped for the battlefield at that time, and hence when they'd gone forward to the trenches, he'd tried to find somewhere quiet to go, and then had realised that he had committed an error and had gone to Bray to hand himself in. He didn't add any further than that, and really had offered no defence at all, and had admitted his offence. At that point, the prosecution and the defence rest, and the court would move out to discuss their findings. It was very brief, and the transcript of the prosecution and the defence only cover a couple of sheets of paper. It was generally accepted, although not written anywhere, that the four members of the board of the court-martial would speak together, and that the most junior officer would go first and offer his verdict, and the senior officer would go last. This was to prevent undue influence on the more junior officer. In this case of Benjamin Hart, they really had no alternative but to pronounce him guilty. And that's what they did when the court reconvened, probably just a few minutes later. Having given their verdict of guilty, there was an automatic, the death penalty was automatically applied at that stage. But there was the possibility of mitigation to follow. The first person that appeared for mitigation was Captain Fison, the adjutant of the 4th Battalion. And he produced Hart's medical record and Hart's disciplinary record. Hart's medical record showed no signs of the complaint of the nervousness that he had said that he had at all, and no sign that he had been wounded at any stage during his time on the Western Front. Next, Fison produced his disciplinary record. This showed a different story, with several entries over the past 8 months in 1916 leading up to December. In the spring, Hart had been convicted of disobeying an order, and he was given a sentence of 28 days field punishment number 1. Field punishment number 1 was essentially designed to humiliate the soldier convicted of the offence and to warn others. It involved being shackled or tied to an object or building where he would be in full sight of his fellow soldiers. In the case of the artillery, this was often a gun wheel. But the rules and regulations were very strict on this form of punishment. They could only be shackled for 2 hours at a time. There were also regulations on the number of days in a row that they could be subject to the punishment and the total number of days. While undergoing that period of field punishment number 1, Hart then went absent. When he returned, he was given another 28-day period of field punishment number 1. Shortly after that offence, he deserted, and when brought back, he was charged with desertion, and he was tried by Field General Court-Martial. This means that in December 1916, at his second court-martial, Hart was probably the most experienced person in the room at the time. During that first court-martial, he was not found guilty of desertion, but was found guilty of attempted desertion, an offence that also attracted the death penalty. But on this occasion, the death penalty was not applied, and instead he was awarded 5 years penal servitude, suspended for the period of the war. With that suspended sentence hanging over him, he had then been found guilty again of desertion on this occasion, and therefore the court had no real alternative to confirm the death penalty at that point in time. The second person to appear for Hart's mitigation was Hart himself. Hart gave a brief statement in which he said earlier in the year in 1916, while deployed in the area of the brick stacks up towards the Le Basset Canal, He had been buried by a mine, and this is what had caused his bad nerves and left him in a poor mental state. He also stated at the time that despite having joined the 4th Battalion in 1913, when the battalion deployed in 1914, he had been told he was not required and left behind. And it wasn't until early 1916 that he eventually rejoined the rest of the battalion in France. At the end of the mitigation process, the court was closed and Hart was put into cells while the sentence was confirmed. This was quite a long process because every officer in the chain of command above Hart had a chance to review the case, and any one of them could decide to reduce the penalty from the death penalty to penal servitude again if they thought that Hart's case warranted it. His CO, Colonel Copeman, certainly did not feel very much sympathy for Hart. He said that from a fighting point of view, Hart's behaviour had been bad, and he's from a general point of view indifferent, and that he had showed cowardice on previous occasions. He confirmed the sentence and passed the file up the chain of command. The next to review it was the Brigade Commander, who commented that several soldiers in the 4th Battalion at the time showed poor behaviour, and that he considered an example should be made at that time of Benjamin Hart. The Divisional Commander also agreed, and the file moved on again and landed on the desk of the Corps Commander, General John Duquesne of 15th Corps. Duquesne paused. He took a look at the file and read through it carefully and said to himself, "We need to check a few things here before we condemn this man to death. He says he has poor nerves, nobody has checked. He says he was buried by a mine, nobody has checked." And so Duquesne calls for more information before he makes his decision. First, he asks for witnesses from the 4th Battalion to confirm whether Hart had been buried. 2 soldiers who were with him at the time come forward and make written statements. One to say that yes, he had seen Hart buried by a German mine exploding near the brick stacks, and in fact he had been one of those that had dug him out. And the second soldier said that he had also seen Hart being dug out and then led away in a terrible state afterwards. Next, Duquesne sent Hart for a medical examination. He went to see the chief neurologist of 4th Army, Captain William Brown. William Brown was at the forefront of neurology at the time and would later work at Craig Lockhart, the hospital that dealt with Sassoon and Owen and their mental difficulties. It wasn't a short once-over. Brown kept Hart under observation for 4 days, and at the end of it wrote a brief statement in which he said he could see absolutely no sign of mental strain or nervousness in Hart during that time. Having received that note from Brown, Duquesne really had nothing further to think about before he also confirmed the death sentence and passed the file on again. By this stage, it's getting towards the end of January 1917, and Hart has been held in cells under the shadow of the death penalty for well over a month. The file next lands on the desk of General Rawlinson, the commander of 4th Army, who wastes very little time or ink in confirming that the death sentence should be carried out. Now, the file must take one final step as well, and at some stage it must land on the desk of the recently promoted Field Marshal Haig. There's no evidence of in the file that this is the case, but the Manual of Military Law quite clearly states that a death sentence could not be confirmed until done so by the commander of the field force deployed, in this case Haig. And Haig himself comments in his diaries of the strain he felt in having to confirm death sentences. By this stage, Hart had been held in custody for over 50 days, but events now started to move very quickly. On the 5th of February 1917, the Divisional Commander, General Pinney, signed off a short note declaring that the death sentence had been confirmed and that execution was to take place the following day, the 6th of February, between 6:30 in the morning and 7:30 at Suzanne, close to the Somme. The part of this process that we know least about is the actual execution of Hart. Beyond that note and the confirmation that it had been carried out by the Assistant Provost Marshal, aside from those details, there is very little else that we know about the execution process itself. We don't know exactly where it took place. We don't know where the soldiers came from that carried out the sentence, or how many were involved in the firing party. This was probably the least regulated part of the system within the British Army, and there was very little in the way of written instructions on how to conduct a firing squad, and therefore it varied in each individual case. And hence many more myths and legends have grown up around the subject of the actual execution. But one thing we do know is that indeed the idea of leaving one rifle unloaded did take place from time to time. In the case of Private Scone, who was executed in May 1918, the instructions for his firing squad are still in his file and confirm that one rifle should be either left unloaded or loaded with a blank round. I personally find this very strange because any soldier that's fired a rifle before is going to know the difference between firing a blank round or no round at all. And therefore the idea behind this, to give any of the soldiers the succour that they could believe that they had not actually taken part in the firing squad, really isn't the case. Hart's body was then moved a short distance from Suzanne up onto the slopes above the Somme to be buried in Suzanne Military Cemetery number 3. That is where the file closes and where the facts of the case end. But it leaves many questions unanswered. What was the state of Hart's mental health when he was executed? There is evidence in his file and elsewhere that perhaps he wasn't fully mentally fit at the time. The 1911 census shows that he had an older sister living in the family who was annotated on the document as being mentally feeble from birth. So perhaps there was some mental illness within the family. Why did he not deploy with the battalion at the end of 1914? Why was he held back? Perhaps again it's because people within the battalion recognised that he was not mentally fit, and it wasn't till 1916 when the requirement for manpower reached a certain level that Hart was deployed. There's one character who is missing from the story. Lieutenant Charles Stormont Gibbs was a very young officer who'd recently been posted to the battalion in France and was, by his own admission, very naive. He wrote about Hart in his diary without mentioning him by name, and those diaries were subsequently published. And in them he recounts that he found Hart a very mentally weak soldier who was not equipped to deal with the rigours of the battlefield, and that he had absented himself several times already. Stormont Gibbs clearly felt some sympathy for him and made him his own Batman, which would have lessened the danger for Hart and meant that he would not have to serve in the front line. But of course, Stormont Gibbs admits that he's very naive, so perhaps Hart has pulled the wool over his eyes. During the course of the court-martial, Hart was entitled to have what was known colloquially as a soldier's friend. That is, an officer that he knew to, in effect, mentor him through the process, to help him to read and understand documents and what was going on and about to happen in the court at the time. Hart does not appear to have had a soldier's friend, The obvious candidate to fulfil the role would have been Stormont Gibbs himself. So why has he not taken that role, and why has no other officer in the battalion taken the role? Perhaps that is because they know that Hart's reputation is poor, and that on this occasion he is likely to feel the full penalty of the law, and they don't want to be linked with him or the process at the time. Why did Hart not deploy in 1914? Perhaps he was recognised as a bad soldier who was likely to cause trouble at that point, and therefore was left behind. There may be another explanation, that he had not signed the Imperial Service Pledge, and therefore could not be forced to deploy until 1916, when conscription was coming around, and at that point, reluctantly, he decided to join the battalion in France. So there are facts of the case, and then there are assumptions and controversy around it. And different people who are listening to this will probably have different beliefs and thoughts on what I've recounted so far. And what this shows is just how difficult it is for us, from the comfort of the 21st century, to attempt to judge these cases in any ways, and how difficult it is for us to shake off our current moral and cultural attitudes and objectively look at why and how these soldiers were dealt with at the time. So what about Hart and his reputation after his death? Once again, this is a subject that's quite often surrounded by myth and rumour. Was he buried in an unmarked grave? No, he wasn't. He's clearly in Suzanne Military Cemetery number 3, with a Commonwealth War Graves headstone, the same as any other soldier in the cemetery. Was he set aside from the others? No, he's in the middle of a row with other soldiers just like him, up to the point where Hart committed his offence. Is there anything on the headstone that sets him aside? No, the headstone is exactly the same as those around him. What about at home? Is Hart remembered at home? Yes, he is. His name is quite clearly on the Ipswich Memorial in Christchurch Park, alongside the name of his elder brother Ernest, who was a sergeant with the 11th Battalion, the Suffolk Regiment, was killed in the Ypres salient in October 1917. He's even remembered on a memorial to those that fell from the Orwell works of Ransom, Sims and Jeffreys. I've used Hart as an example here, but he's not necessarily typical of all those that suffered the same fate. Each one is an individual, and each case is treated slightly differently. But what I hope I've done is laid down some of the facts and the process of military justice during the First World War, and given you cause to think and ponder the fate of Benjamin Hart and other soldiers like him.
Thank you very much to John for a fascinating talk, a very, very level, very measured look at the capital courts-martial process. Very often, as he said, it's a very emotive subject, and very often emotion gets in the way of the facts. A few years ago, all of those who were executed after capital courts-martial were given a blanket pardon by the government, despite the fact that most of them were guilty of the crimes for which they'd been committed. And I think that, in a way, that's the point that John's making, is that the modern emotion, the modern 21st century emotion, very often confuses the issue of guilt of the crime with the fact that very often we don't agree with the punishment that was meted out in a different era. Anyway, that's all for this month. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel, the Great War Hut's YouTube channel, and do tell all your friends about it as well. The more watchers we get, the more views, the more subscribers, the better. So hope you all have a good month, and I'll see you in November.